God declares that I will pour out my spirit on all people, and your sons and daughters will prophesy. That's Acts of the Apostles, 2nd chapter, 17th verse. There's a very old folk tale called The Three Ravens, and it has been around so long it has many variations and versions. It's a story about a young woman who was silent for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days in order to save her 3 brothers who had been turned into ravens by an evil witch. The witch was married to the children's father and was jealous of his affections for his 4 children. So she attempted to cast a spell on them, turning them all into ravens so they could just fly away. But she succeeded only with the 3 boys, as their sister escaped the evil enchantment by running away. It is said she ran away for 3 days and 3 nights. Her brothers, who were ravens, found her and told her the only way they could be returned to human form was if she refrained from speaking for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. And if she made them all shirts from aster flowers. The young woman dearly loved her brothers, so she swore an oath to do exactly as they had said in order to restore them to human form. Immediately she set about gathering the aster flowers and making them into shirts for her brothers, and did not speak a word. Eventually she was discovered by the king of that land, who was instantly smitten by her beauty and took her with him to his palace, where he married her. But the king's mother did not approve of the marriage. She was highly suspicious of a young woman who couldn't speak, and believed this woman was not worthy to be queen of the kingdom. So the king's mother set out to torment the young woman. It wasn't long before the young woman gave birth to a baby. The king's mother secretly took the baby and left a pile of moldy old leaves in its place. When it was discovered that the baby was missing, the king's mother accused the young woman of being a witch who should be burned at the stake for killing her baby. But of course the king didn't believe that. Now the king and the young woman had 2 more babies, and both were secretly kidnapped by the king's mother, who left a pile of dead and rotting leaves in their place. Finally, the king was convinced by his mother that his lovely silent bride should be burnt at the stake for the death of their children. Through it all, the young woman suffered terribly. She suffered the loss of her babies, and she suffered the silence she had to keep, which meant she could not defend herself, not even when she was sentenced to death. There was a point in the story where her grief and her loss and her suffering became so unbearable. She ran away to a secluded place and dug a deep, deep hole. Then she put her head deep inside of that hole and cried and sobbed and let out all her pent-up sorrow and grief and pain. But don't worry, this story has a happy ending. Coincidentally, the 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days ended just as the young woman was being led to her execution, and her brothers, the ravens, arrived just at that moment. Now she had finished their aster flower shirts, and she was able to throw the shirts over her brothers, who were instantly transformed back into young men, and she was able to break her silence. She and her husband were reunited with their children, who were still alive, and the king's mother got what was coming to her. But the part of the story that has lingered with me over the years is the part where the brave young woman just couldn't bear the burden of her silence any longer. She had lived through a lot, but every joyful event and every tragic loss was made worse by her inability to speak. The silence created an even deeper pain inside of her that she finally had to find a way to express, or she felt she would die and then she wouldn't be able to save anybody. And since she had no other way, she dug a hole in the ground and filled that hole with her sobs. perhaps it's a good cautionary tale about the harm forced and imposed silence can cause a person. Now, this might seem like an inappropriate story to share today on the Sunday when we are celebrating Pentecost, the gift of the Holy Spirit. Whether we remember it through the Gospel according to John, where the risen Jesus stood suddenly among his disciples as they sat behind locked doors and breathed on them the Holy Spirit, the life-giving breath of God. Or we remember the exciting story in Acts of the Apostles when the followers of Jesus were together in the upper room and there was a mighty rush of wind and tongues of fire, and suddenly Jesus' followers just couldn't stay put anymore. They had to run into the crowded streets of Jerusalem, suddenly able to speak languages they didn't know, telling everyone of God's goodness and love. Today is one of the major feast days and celebrations in the church. Now, when we are together for worship, it is often a custom to celebrate this day by having the gospel read in as many different languages as possible. Some of you may have some good memories of such Pentecost Sundays, and it can be a fun way to try to recreate the powerful events of the day. But the problem with that kind of practice is that it can miss the point of what happened in Jerusalem that day. What we end up hearing in such a church service is usually just a cacophony of incomprehensible noise instead of the gospel. But that is not what the people in Jerusalem heard. They heard the good news in words they recognized and could understand. They felt noticed. And that is what was powerful. Pentecost Sunday isn't a day of noise. It's a day when the followers of Jesus heard the call of God through the Holy Spirit and then shared what they heard, not as an incomprehensible scream into a hole in the ground, but with words that outsiders could understand, words that gave hope and invitation to a hurting world. That is what we celebrate today. However, considering the events of the past week, many of us might not feel like celebrating. We aren't together in person yet, even though many businesses are reopening and some other churches are meeting in person. And that might create some sour feelings. This week, the total number of people who died from COVID-19 reached 100,000, making this virus, as writer Mitch Albom observed in an article in U.S. Today, one of the fastest killers in U.S. history. It's even more heartbreaking for those of us painfully aware that the majority of those deaths are in the African American and Native American communities and people who are elderly. And there was yet another senseless murder of an African American man by someone whose job is to protect, not destroy life. This time in Minneapolis. And this has been another source of deep pain that has sparked outrage. So I completely understand if you don't feel like celebrating today. And all these causes for sorrow could help us notice that perhaps our past celebrations of Pentecost, despite their glorious music, the carefully scripted lingual choreography, the stirring sermons, sort of missed the point of the day. Maybe it is only where we are right now, sheltering in place, maybe getting bored with online worship options, missing our old routines and ways of being together, sitting in our socially distant isolation with broken hearts, that the spirit of this Holy Spirit Day can touch us even more deeply and touch reality more deeply than before. Maybe it can even touch those places inside of ourselves that we have been keeping silent for a long, long time. Those places that we know about but don't talk about, except maybe when we angry post on Facebook. And there are times social media feels, at least to me, like that hole the young woman sobbed into. But while it might feel good to release pent-up sorrow or anger into the cacophony of outrage on social media, it doesn't necessarily go very far or change much of anything. In the Holy Spirit's care, those places in us might begin to not only heal, but find the encouragement needed to empower us to do the hard work the world needs us modern followers of Jesus to do right now. The day described in the book of Acts was a day a movement began, and now that movement is in our hands, in our hearts, in our souls. A movement to help bring heaven and earth closer together, to work with God to build a world where loving God and loving our neighbors aren't just words we say, but the way everything from education to government to religion to business to healthcare, you name it, is based on. Now that can be overwhelming work, and we are right to ask, where does it all begin? Perhaps a good place to begin is with the prophecy of Joel mentioned in the book of Acts in today's reading. In those days, God will send God's Spirit on all people, and all people shall prophesy. Too often, we fail to understand what prophecy really means. We mistake it for fortune-telling, but prophecy is a tradition that goes back to the Old Testament, our Jewish siblings' Bible. Prophets were not seers of the future. They were men and women who listened to God and spoke what they heard, and their message was pretty much always the same. They warned people that they were not living God's way, they were not loving God, they were not loving their neighbors, and any society that does not live by loving God and loving our neighbors is going to fail and fall. And if you read much of the Old Testament, you'd see the prophets were correct. And when their world fell down around them, the prophets had more words of support, even love and help. Through poetry, like in the Psalms, prophets helped people name reality. The things they had lost, the ways systems had been unjust, and the pain they felt over what they lost. The prophets helped them grieve these changes. And those who listened to the prophets, who were able to grieve, then found there was new life on the other side of expressing their grief. And that was where they found hope. Today, there are prophets among us who are calling us to do the same thing. They are asking us not to be silent, but to name and grieve our losses and our sorrows. The leaders of the Episcopal Church, including our presiding bishop, other denominational and religious leaders, and civic leaders in our country, are calling for Monday, June 1st, to be a national day of mourning and lament. It is a day when churches are asked to ring church bells at noon, flags are to be flown at half-mast, and other public forms of displaying grief are to be observed. The intention of the day is to name our grief by lamenting the pain and sorrow we feel. Church of the Good Shepherd is participating in the day by offering a brief prayer service at 12:15 via Zoom. And you can find the link for that service in the Sunday church email, and I hope that you join me. We hope this will be a start for letting ourselves give voice to, name, and work through the sorrow and grief we may be feeling personally and on behalf of a hurting world, so that we can begin listening to the Holy Spirit and follow where it calls us. As author, theologian, and former Bishop of Durham, N.T. Wright, has written in his brand new book, God in the Pandemic, quote, "Out of lament of God's people, new possibilities can and do emerge," unquote. It is possible that we don't have to rush to return to normal, because COVID-19 is showing us our normal was a way of life that was deeply flawed with iniquity and inequality. It exposes that we have not been loving God and we have not been loving our neighbors. And we can name and grieve this, because that is the first step to realizing and living into new possibilities. This is not a time to let silence press in on us. As theologian and professor emeritus of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, Walter Brueggemann has written in his book, Reality, Grief, Hope, 3 Urgent Prophetic Tasks, unexpressed sorrow can manifest in violence and harm. This is a time to listen to the prophets among us and accept the invitation to face some difficult truths and lament. For that is how we move into hope, a hope that we can share with the world. Please join me for the Zoom prayer service tomorrow. I am longing to see you and begin this, our new work and ministry together.